With the main series Pokemon games currently having 19 types, it seems like someone is always talking about what's gonna be the next one. And you can't blame them. It's really fun to think about what new types might be able to do to the game's meta, what old Pokemon and moves they could be retroactively applied to, and what new tropes or archetypes of Pokemon might be able to be brought into the series due to them. Hi, I'm PokeThink, and for the last few months, I've scoured the internet to learn about every Pokemon fan type I could. Today, I'm gonna show off my findings. First talking about some popular fan types that I don't think belong in the series, and then moving on to 3 that inspired me to create new types of my own. Back in January, I posted this video where I talked about these popular fan types. If you haven't heard my takes on those yet, maybe go back and watch that video first, especially because one of these types will make a reappearance in today's video. Also in that video, I had a few guidelines for what I think makes a great new Pokemon type. To reiterate them briefly, first, I think the new Pokemon type needs a strong identity that stands up on its own and doesn't create a lot of overlap with other types. So in this video, I won't be talking about any split types like wind, bird, magma, or sand. Second, a new Pokemon type obviously needs to have type matchups that help the meta, but I also think that they should make some logical sense. Not every type has matchups that make sense, but I think that all of the newly introduced ones kind of do. And thirdly, a new type should be able to apply to at least a few Pokemon from the past. This one's not as important, but I think that it's still kind of needed. So now with all that, let's move on to some types that I don't think make the cut. So let's start off with a fan type that gets a lot of discussion already. I think at first glance, Magic seems like something that would be a really easy addition to the franchise. However, there's already themes of Magic wrapped up in the Psychic and Fairy types, most notably on Delphox, Hoopa, Galarian Slowking, the Hatterene line, and maybe Jinx to some extent. Taking Magic out of Psychic's identity is pretty easy in my mind, but it would be harder with Fairy, despite the Fairy type having less obviously Magic-esque Pokemon. I think Psychic has just historically been about the power of the mind and ESP and all that, with just a few magical exceptions. But the Fairy type's whole vibe is characterized by a sort of otherworldly, misty mysteriousness. A great way to explain this dilemma would be that if Pokemon were Harry Potter, Harry and his friends would be the Magic type, but all the creatures they meet like elves, centaurs, and pixies would be the Fairy type. But Pokemon are all creatures after all, and I wouldn't want the Magic type to just be full of humanoid Pokemon with witch hats and wands. Furthermore, I think this struggle also creeps into its type effectiveness. Magic seems like it should have interactions with other supernatural types like Dark, Ghost, Fairy, and Dragon, so our type chart is already looking pretty similar to Psychic and Fairy. I think Dark and Ghost should definitely be weak to it, but I could go either way with Dragon, as dragons often have resistance to different kinds of magic in fantasy. This really tempts me to try to make a type triangle with Magic, Dragon, and Fairy, but I feel like it doesn't make sense for Magic to be super effective against Fairy, since fairies are themselves magical. I think a mutual resistance honestly makes the most sense, but I don't think Fairy needs any more help being the best type. You could have some more natural types resist Magic though, like Bug, Ice, and Grass, which all could use some buffs to their defenses. But overall, I think while Magic is a cool idea for Pokemon to go after, it just steps too much on the toes of the Fairy type for my liking, so I'm gonna mark this fan type as a reject for me. Fungi is a fan type that actually seems kind of promising at first. Fungi would be an extraction of the grass type, and I think that fungi and plants actually have enough differences in real life that I think some of them could end up being represented on the type chart. The grass type's interactions are really logical and straightforward, being strong against water, rock, and ground because its roots have to dig through soil and rocks to get water that can be used for photosynthesis. But fungi don't have roots, and they don't get their nutrients in the same way. They're saprotrophs, meaning they get their nutrients from feeding off dead or decaying matter. So, you could have a fungus type be strong against organic things like grass and bug, but also ghost since they feed off dead things. In terms of weaknesses though, I think fungi would still be pretty similar to grass. It would still make sense for it to take super effective damage from flying, fire, ice, and maybe also poison. I like how ice and poison could be buffed there, but it does feel kind of lazy to buff them by basically just making a second grass type. The big issue with the fungi type for me is just originality of design. Plants and fungi are both representative of entire kingdoms of organisms, that's true, but fungi seem to be a lot more visually homogeneous than plants. We've only got 5 lines of fungus Pokemon in the game right now, 6 if you count Brute Bonnet as separate. And out of them, I think Parasect is really the only one with a unique design. Compare that with the vast amount of existing grass types that represent different flowers, fruits, and general foresty vibes, and I think you can see the problem that I'm getting at. For that reason, this type gets a rejection from me. Alright, so I think everybody's thought of a potential time type at least a little since this bad boy entered the series, or if you're a 90s kid, maybe it was when you watched this movie. It makes sense, right? Time is a fundamental force of our universe and often a common theme in fantasy, sci-fi, RPGs, and pop culture in general. I think you'd have to get pretty creative with type interactions for a time type, but I think we could just start out thinking about what things in life are most affected by time. Things like bugs, birds, and plants might pass away over time, while dragons and fairies might be more eternal, along with inorganic material like rock, ground, and steel. So maybe those could be some of its offenses, but I'm not so sure about defenses. I also don't think there's many other Pokemon than Dialga and Celebi that could be time-typed, but that's not to say that Game Freak would have too much trouble making some new ones. However, I think at the end of the day, the novelty of a time type just wears off after you think about it for a while, so I'll give it a rejection. Alright, and then if I mention time, I definitely have to mention this one. It certainly got enough comments on the last video. I don't really think a nuclear type is something that Game Freak would ever do. It's just too out there, especially for a game that is heavily marketed towards kids. Plus, I think this would just kind of end up as an offshoot of the poison type, maybe with some differences, like it could be super effective against water to represent how a nuclear explosion can vaporize it. But I don't think these would really warrant an entirely new type. Instead, maybe we could just see some nuclear-themed poison-type Pokemon with an ability like Corrosion that affects its type chart. Also, if a Pokemon was nuclear-typed, I just kind of feel like it would be hard to get past the idea that it's sick or something. I guess you could say the same about the poison type, but there are poisonous and venomous animals in real life, so that doesn't feel like such a stretch. Anyways, this one gets another rejection. But you know what never gets a rejection from me? A great night of sleep. That's right, baby. Today we're sponsored by Manta Sleep. If you've been watching any of my latest videos, you'll know that Manta Sleep is a company that makes high-quality sleep masks that block out 100% of light around you. And listen, these things work. They sent me their Manta Sound Sleep Mask, which doesn't just block out light, but can also play something like white noise while I'm falling asleep. And I use it religiously. It's really comfortable, really easy to adjust, and it's definitely improved the sleep I'm getting. And on top of that, they make a bunch of different types of masks for whatever your preferences might be. So if better sleep sounds like something that you want to get more of, or would be a really great gift for someone you know this holiday season, then use code POKETHINK at checkout for 10% off at Manta Sleep. So now let's move on to some types that, oh, what's that? I think I'm hearing we have time for a bonus type. Okay, so this one is from the comments on my last video about types, and it's one that I've literally never heard of before. I'm just gonna put it in this section of the video because I don't wanna take any credit for it. Kefkiren, hope I'm saying that right, comments, a new type that I've thought about adding is the Mimic type. Given that Dragon, Ghost, and Fairy are already a thing, adding another iconic classification of monster as a type just makes sense to me. Then, they go on to list Pokemon like Sudowoodo, Amoonguss, Electrode, Klefki, Ditto, and the Zoroark line as Pokemon that could fit this description. The commenter didn't describe any type interactions for this, but had the cool idea of making Metronome always gain stab when used by a Mimic-type Pokemon. So just for fun, let's expand on this idea a little bit. I think you could make Mimics weak to fire and poison, since burning a Mimic with flames or acid would be a pretty good way to get rid of them. Mimic itself could be strong against Psychic since they trick the mind, and surprises kind of fit into the fear theme that all of Psychic's other weaknesses have in common. Mimic could also be strong against Fairy, mostly for similar reasons, but honestly just for the debuff. Mimic could be resisted by Steel for obvious reasons, and then also by Dark, since that's a type that's well versed in trickery, and Mimic could also resist the types that it's strong against. But now, let's move on to some types that I've spent a little more time thinking about and that I think would be better additions to the type chart. So in the first video I made on Pokemon fan types, I talked about the light and sound type and ultimately rejected them. Now, I got a lot of comments about the sound type in particular. I don't think that any of these really changed my mind about sound as a type, but I did see some that made me realize we could fix the type by making one simple change. But before we get to that, let's review the pros and cons of sound as a type. Pro, sound already has quite an identity in the Pokemon franchise, as it currently works as a pseudo-type, having certain moves and abilities that interact with it, like Soundproof, Throat Chop, and Throat Spray. Another pro, there's already lots of Pokemon that fit the bill for a sound type, like Rillaboom, Toxtricity, and the X-Cloud line. Con, I do think that the type kind of struggles with type interactions. I think some arguments based on conductivity have convinced me that sound could be strong against water, ground, and steel, and then also resisted by grass. Ice is kind of a double-edged sword there though, because snow would not be a good conductor of sound, but ice could perhaps be shattered by sound at the right frequency. Bug could then be immune to sound, as it turns out that most bugs that don't make noise themselves are deaf. Now you might be thinking that that all sounds pretty great, but what about sound's defenses? Maybe it could resist types that it's strong against, but what would it be weak against? Does grass or bug really make sense for that? Can you really hurt sound, since it isn't really a tangible thing, but is just vibrations caused by pressure differences? And obviously, not every Pokemon type has perfectly logical type interactions, but I really want to argue that a new type added into the series should. Another con would be that you have some mechanical weirdness if sound becomes a type, since it's already a pseudo-type. An ability like Soundproof feels a lot clunkier when its description changes from grants immunity to sound moves to grants immunity to the sound type and other sound-esque moves of other types. So, how can we retain the good parts of a potential sound type, but remedy some of the bad parts? I think we can do this by instead calling it the music type. Now, you might be sighing, thinking that this is a small and insignificant change, but I think the big difference is that it really shifts the identity of the type from being more definitional to more aesthetic. As I said before, sound is not really a tangible thing, but rather is just vibrations caused by pressure differences in a substance. Music is also not really tangible, but it is defined subjectively, informed by our emotions and cultural backgrounds, and I think this would make it easier to theme Pokemon and moves around the type. Being called music almost gives the type some magical properties too, as music is often used in folklore during war, for rituals, and to ward off evil spirits and creatures. For an example of what I'm talking about, let's look at the type chart again. Music could be strong against Ghost and Dragon, as they might be susceptible to magical uses of music. Music could also be strong against Flying, because many birds use songs to attract mates, and this is often exploited by hunters. Music could still be strong against Water, mostly for the reasons I said before, but also because there are a lot of tropes in folklore of musical instruments that can control tides, rain, or fish. Music could maybe also be strong against Fairy for the same reason as Ghost and Dragon, but I think there are a lot of stories about fairies using music as magic themselves, so I'll keep the interaction neutral for now. Music could be weak to electric due to static interference, ice and fire because extreme temperatures can affect the pitch that musical instruments create, and music could also be weak to itself, since playing two different melodies at the same time could create a lot of dissonance. Music could resist Ghost, Dragon, and Rock, because I can't resist that pun, and then it could be resisted by electric, ice, and fire. Bug could remain immune to it, since again, a lot of bugs are deaf. So I kind of hope this illustrates how it feels like we have more to pull from in terms of inspiration, since music is a more subjective, cultural concept than sound. And of course, music would have already been packaged into a sound type, but I think this really just helps solidify an identity for the type. And I think it's also nice that we can do game balance some favors, nerfing Water and buffing Ice and Bug. The music type also solves this issue of overwriting the sound pseudo-type. All music type moves could automatically be made to be sound moves, but then moves like Bug Buzz, Chatter, or Psychic Noise could remain within the sound pseudo-type. In terms of what Pokemon I would make music type, I think I'd do the X-Cloud line as pure music types, the Kricketune line as bug music types, Chatot as flying music, Maractus as a grass music type, Meloetta as a normal music and fighting music type, and the Noivern line as dragon music types. I'd keep Toxtricity as electric poison, since it's got such a strong identity with that type combo, but I'd maybe just change its second ability from plus and minus to something else, which could give it stab on music type moves. Maybe we could call this Hard Rock as opposed to its first ability, Punk Rock. And then I think it'd be really cool to see a ghost music evolution for Mismagius that leans more into a Banshee theme, and maybe a grass music form of Rillaboom and a fire music form of Skeledirge, just since I don't think they're going to change any starter types. You could also make an electric music form of Rotom really easily. Lastly, I'll say that the music type should be immune to confusion. The ability Own Tempo is currently what grants immunity to confusion, and I think music type Pokemon would probably be great tempo keepers, so it just seems like a no-brainer to me. What do you think of the music type? Let me know what you think in the comments, but now we'll move on to our next type. So next up, I had the idea to combine a bunch of types that don't seem to stand up well on their own, but generally serve similar purposes. The first of these is the well-known Beast Fan type. This new type could kind of combat the trend we have where regular-looking animals are often just relegated to the normal type, but then it could also be applied to other bestial Pokemon of any type, like Arcanine, Luxray, or Mightyena. I think you could come up with some clever type interactions for the Beast type, but it does kind of just move the normal type problem over the fence a bit. Game Freak is already pretty loose on what counts as a dragon, so using a vague term like Beast might just result in this type feeling a little overused. Second, I've seen a lot of people talk similarly about a desire for a dinosaur or fossil type. A dino type seems way too similar to dragon for my taste, especially with Pokemon like Tyrantrum and Baxcalibur. But I do sympathize with the desire there. Outside of Pokemon, dragons and dinosaurs feel distinct, at least to me they do. And I think they come with their own set of tropes and stories, so separating the two might be cool. And thirdly, just like how in the last video I pitched a Techno type to fill the digital or artificial role, it might be cool to have some sort of ancient or primordial type in the games. The Paradox Pokemon are a great example of this. Future Paradox Pokemon are mostly either part Steel, Electric, or Psychic, and past Paradox Pokemon are mostly Fighting, Dark, and Dragon. Something like the Techno type I made in my last video would be great for future Paradox Pokemon, but it would be cool to have something like that for the past ones too. Dinosaur would also help fit the bill here, but wouldn't it be cool if the type could also be applied to like the Ancient Power evolutions? So looking at all three of these semi-popular fan ideas, what might be able to be consolidated? We want to be able to give a buff to some normal type Pokemon, we want a more clear representation of dinosaur-like creatures, and we want some kind of Pokemon type that might represent the past or prehistory well. Enter the Primal type. I like the word primal because it helps give off the vibe we're going for, but it doesn't pigeonhole us into one type of animal or anatomy. Tyrantrum could be Primal type, but so could Mamoswine or Yanmega. Some of the normal types we mentioned, like Slacking and Pyroar, could also fit the bill since they are kind of the kings of their respective ecosystem. I think even Claydol would be a good contender for the type, since its Pokedex entries talk about how it was made by an ancient civilization dating back 20,000 years. And yeah, I know there's a slight issue with the name since Primal Kyogre and Groudon are already a thing. But I think it could slide since firstly, we already know that the Pokemon franchise takes place in a multiverse, so maybe whatever game has the Primal type just doesn't have Primal Kyogre and Groudon. But also, there's some precedent for stomping on a term like this, since there are some Pokemon cards like Dark Charizard and Dark Dragonite out there. So let's talk about the type chart, which I'm really excited about. First off, I think you could finally get this really interesting type triangle with Fairy, Dragon, and Primal. Fairy is strong against Dragon and immune to it, so what if Primal was strong against Fairy and immune to it, and Dragon was strong against Primal and immune to it? The triangle will never be perfect since Dragon is also strong against itself, and this many immunities might make the competitive scene a little crazy, so you could just keep the offensive advantages if you wanted. This might help game balance from feeling like Fairy came in and just replaced Dragon as the best type in the game, to feeling like now there are three obviously best types in the game, each with its unique advantages and disadvantages. Let's say that Primal is also strong against Psychic, kind of flipping the script on Brains over Brawn with Instinct over Intellect. Primal could be weak to Fire and Rock as asteroids killed the dinosaurs. It should probably also be weak to Steel, representing civilization conquering large, ancient animals. But Steel is already good against Fairy, and I don't want to stack too many weaknesses on top of Primal. So we'll play the game balance card and just say that Steel resists Primal, along with Electric for similar reasons. Then lastly, we'll say that Primal resists Psychic since it's strong against it, and we'll also give it a resistance to Fighting to show off its superiority. In terms of what Pokemon I'd like to see be Primal type, I have a lot of ideas, but I wouldn't expect them all to be changed. I think Fossils would be unlikely to be changed, but Rampardos could be Rock Primal, Bastiodon could be Steel Primal, Aerodactyl, Flying Primal, Archeops, Flying Primal, Tyrantrum, Rock Primal, and Aurorus, Ice Primal. The previously mentioned Ancient Power evolutions could become Primal Ice, Primal Bug, and Primal Grass, respectively. And then I think Slacking could be Normal Primal, Aggron could be Steel Primal, Claydol could be Psychic Primal, or Ground Primal, I think they both work. Drapion could be made Poison Primal, Scolipede could be made Bug Primal, Pyroar could be Fire Primal, Lycanroc could be Rock Primal, Tyranitar could be Rock Primal or Primal Dark, Baxcalibur could be Ice Primal, and of course, you could take your pick of the past Paradox Pokemon, but I think the best contenders would be Great Tusk as Ground Primal, Slitherwing as Bug Primal, and the legendary beasts as Water, Fire, and Electric Primal. I would also love to see Seviper and Zangoose get Poison Primal and Normal Primal evolutions, along with maybe some Poison Primal forms of Nidoking and Nidoqueen. And don't think I would forget about Meganium getting a Grass Primal form. And last but not least, I want to give the Primal type a unique feature. I think something that would be really cool and fit in with the type would be giving the Primal type an immunity to flinches and intimidations, since they're just absolute brutes. I'm not into the competitive scene at all, but I hear Intimidate is a pretty good ability, so it'd be interesting to see it taken down a peg. So what do you think of the Primal type? Let me know down below, but now I'll move into our last type of the video. So for our last type, we're going to do another twist on a popular fan type, that being the Rubber type. Rubber is one that I see a lot, and at first it really confused me, but I think the general idea is that it's really just a stretchy or blob type. It could house Pokemon like Swalot, Goodra, or maybe even the Tangrowth line. While I think that the type identity is kind of weak, I don't know, maybe it would just have to be kind of a silly type that doesn't take itself too seriously, I think that there are some clear type interactions that it could have. Rubber should of course be immune to electric, as it's an insulator, and just for simplicity's sake, we'll say that it's super effective against electric as well. Rubber could also maybe be strong against the fairy type since it's an artificial material, but I think that's kind of a loose idea. I think it could be easily weak to fire, ice, and steel since rubber is susceptible to being heated to the point of melting, freezing to the point of brittleness, and cut to pieces by sharp objects. Throw in some resistances to fairy and fighting, and then have steel, rock, and ground resist it, and you've got a pretty decent mock-up. However, you know the drill for the video. The type chart is not the only thing I want to take account for. I think an area I really don't like for the rubber type is its sense of identity. If the rubber is literal, then it feels way too much like an artificial or plastic type to my taste, and that doesn't sit well with me when it's being applied to otherwise totally organic Pokemon. And if rubber is more of a metaphor for anything stretchy or balloony, then I feel like we're gonna end up with a lot of Pokemon having 3-type syndrome. So what if we moved away from a more manufactured rubber idea and entered a more slimy or gooey territory? In fact, that's a pretty good name right there. Let's just call it the goo type. I think goo would have a stronger sense of identity since it's something more natural and creature-like, and it's something that's already kind of an RPG staple. Goo also just feels like it could have more inspiration than rubber, since you could play around with what the goo is. Not all of these are great examples, they're somewhat hyperbolic, but I think Muck could be a goo-type Pokemon because it's a poison slime, while Ditto could be a goo-type due to its rubbery body. The Macargo line could be a goo-type since they're based on magma. Alcremie could be a goo-type since it's made of cream, and Dipplin could even be made a goo-type since it's covered in syrup. Again, some of these are stretches, but I think the point still stands. Goo is just a bit more expansive than rubber in terms of interpretation. But so what would the type chart look like if we added in a goo type? I think we'd be able to make some good game balance changes that still make logical sense. First off, let's keep rubber's immunity to electric on the goo type, since that's still a fairly common trope. Just check out some of the ooze monsters in Dungeons & Dragons, for example. We could make goo strong against electric, again just for simplicity, and then we could also have it be strong against water, since it could muck up rushing water and make it too viscous to flow properly. I'm tempted to make goo strong against fairy, but since I already picked on fairy with the primal type, let's instead say that goo is strong against steel, as right now there's not really a rust metaphor on the type chart, and goo could either melt through metal or corrode it. Goo could resist water due to the viscosity reason, but we'll have it just take neutral damage from steel. Goo should of course also be resistant to fighting, since punching a big blob isn't gonna do much likely. Water and Steel are some of the best types in the game, so I think these debuffs could be welcome, but making Goo strong against both of them might call for some reasonable drawbacks to be added. First, I think Bug could be strong against Goo, since bugs could infest the Goo and thrive within it. Second, Ice could be strong against Goo, since freezing it could make it brittle, just like rubber. And third, I think Goo should be resisted by Bug and Ice, but also Poison, since Poison also has these tropes of acid and corrosion. Given all that, what Pokemon would I make the Goo type? I think I'd make the Muck line Pure Goo, which could enhance its foiled relationship with the Weezing line. And then I'll make the Alolan Muck line Goo Dark. Ditto could become a pure Goo type, but not that it really matters. I don't want to take Fire Rock away from Macargo, so I'll pass on that, but I will turn Gulpin and Swalot into pure Goo types. Trubbish and Garbodor can be Poison Goo though, just since Trash definitely deserves to have the Poison typing attached to it. The Reuniclus line could be Psychic Goo, and the Goodra line could be Dragon Goo. Pyukumuku could be Water Goo, along with the Wugtrio line, and the Alchemy line could be Fairy Goo. Also, I'm not totally sure about this one, but I feel like Melmetal would be as close to a Steel Goo type as we would get, at least with the current Pokedex. Then lastly, let's give the Goo type a unique feature. Something that feels fitting would be giving the Goo type its own form of terrain. We could just call it Gooey Terrain to keep things simple. While Gooey Terrain is active, we could make all critical hits against grounded Pokemon either do reduced or no damage, as the Goo might help protect the Pokemon's weak spots. Additionally, we could make Gooey Terrain negate any effects that rely on contact, since the Goo could reduce contact between Pokemon. I feel like that would be a really useful move in a Nuzlocke, just to really ensure your Pokemon's safety. And while maybe that sounds a little too strong, then maybe terrain removal would become more important. So there's 3 new Pokemon types. Let me know what you think of them in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked the video. And I'll catch y'all in the next one.